we get a high-ranking member of the Chantry now interject in Hadrian's comments about the Cielsen and basically accuse him of heresy to his face.
This lady gives me the vibe that she is bad news extra large. This is different than just mouthing off in front of Dad. This is mouthing off in front of the faction that glasses planets.
Welcome to another episode of the Devil's Rest Book Club, where we dive into the details of Christopher Rocchio's Sun Eater universe. I am your slithering on my belly, ready to pounce with my poison-fanged snake host, Cameron. And with me, as always, is the mongoose across the battlefield from me, ready to bite my throat and kill me, Drew. Drew, how are you doing this week?
I am doing wonderful. And this week, we're going to be covering chapters 53 through 55 of the first book of the series, Empire of Silence. Very interesting section of the story. I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, big introductions here. And
Yes.
Now we are beyond exposition. The plot is continually moving, and it won't stop for a very, very, very long time. But before we get into the new stuff, what did we encounter in our last episode with Hadrian's story?
Yes, so in our last episode, we had a fun trek to an alienage for the Umand. We had some interesting exposure to that and some growing relationship stuff between Hadrian and Valka. We also had an interesting chapter where Hadrian is teaching the Count's children some swordplay and a small confrontation with Gilliam Voss, where he once again reemphasizes his disapproval for Hadrian and tells him that he needs to back off and not be too familiar. And then we have the section closed out by more relationship building between Hadrian and Valka, and they're in the room, they're kind of talking about what they're passionate about and sort of gradually kind of building a connection together. Hadrian seems to imply that something meaningful changed on that night when they were connecting to each other. Mostly relationship building, but also some political tension rising with Gilliam still.
There we go. And we begin with chapter 53, a game of snake and mongoose. So we get another dinner sequence. This is meant to directly mirror the dinner sequence at the very beginning of the book. Hadrian is dining, albeit not at the head of the table anymore. He's, a little further down in the pecking order. But we have a Mataro feast at which Hadrian is attending. And if we remember the last time that Hadrian was at a feast, he couldn't help but talk too much about the Cielsen and was on the verge of committing heresy in front of everybody, including his father's business contacts. So let's see how he behaves at this dinner.
Round 2.
Yeah. As with everything between Balian Mataro and Alistair Marlowe, these dinners could not be more different. Again, the set and setting is super extravagant. When we picture Delos, we're in this gray, muted hall. And although they have a wonderful dinner spread and that's filled with game meat and all this different stuff, that doesn't exist here on Imesh. And the bounty and the real food at this dinner is seafood. And so there's this 10 to 12 foot long conger eel-like alien creature that's the main course. You've got all these accompaniments, and an interesting world-building thing. The further away from the head of the table you got, the more unnatural the food became. So the lab-grown meat, the vat-based meat, is at the other end of the table opposite Balian Mataro, whereas all of the fresh stuff that's come in from off-planet, I think he even mentions potatoes and peppers and things like that. Potatoes there's no way, unless they have technology to do this, that potatoes grow on Imesh. Potatoes come from like a mountainous region in Peru on our planet. They're not growing them on coral reefs. So he probably gets a lot of stuff flown in. It's extremely extravagant. But I loved the idea that seafood, the more natural food, the bounty of the natural ocean is what the nobles would eat, because that's the most expensive.
I also just love the visual of the giant eel thing. That sounds awful, but you could see it almost visually in the screen in your head of the big eel across the table. Very visual display by Rocky here. It's a great paint to set the scene.
Have you had eel before?
I'm sure I've had eel on sushi before.
It's maybe my favorite fish. Like, eel is fantastic.
Oh, interesting. I will have to order it again at some point and
it's so good.
Take
smoked barbecued eel or something like that. It's just
sounds crazy
unbelievable.
I'll give it a shot.
elegant, but it also makes you think. It says eel-like. It doesn't say an eel.
That's fair. Yeah.
Congruous is the term that gets used, and so there's probably some alien elements to this that make it even more interesting. I hope to see that whenever we see this on the screen at some point. But also the hall itself compared to Delos, right? We were in an enclosed hall that is on Devil's Rest, so blacks and dark wood and all this different stuff. This sort of darkness of Devil's Rest is overlooking this whole thing. This, where they're eating now, is in this outdoor sort of dining room setting with the sun setting outside, but they have a static field around this huge table in this huge dining hall, so they could basically eat outside while having temperature controlled stuff. So like the vibe is completely different than what we'd get. So I just love the contrasting.
Yeah.
The elements of the environment around them contrast just as much as the characters' styles do. And not only that, just to show even more opulence compared to music being put over speakers or whatever, a live string quartet is playing for them as they are eating dinner. As I mentioned, Hadrian is seated probably toward the middle of the table. He's like 12 seats down from the head, which is still pretty high up considering the fact that this guy's a tutor to young kids.
Yeah.
But he is not over at the Motaro end yet, but he's also not at the lab-grown meat section either. So he's pretty high up. Next to him is seated a perfume merchant, and on the other side, a Legion officer by the name of Bassander Lin. So just as a note, the fact that he names this person in particular should tell us something. If this was just some nameless dinner guest that he met, they would not be important. So the fact that he specifically calls this Legion officer out by name is important, and we'll find out a little bit more why in just a minute.
Yep.
Also, at the end of the section of his table, probably sitting across from him, is Valka with Sir Elamas Redgrave as well, her patron. So he's pretty high up in the social pecking order. Luckily for him, he is not seated near Gilliam, not directly in eyesight. They're seated on the same side of the table, so they don't have to necessarily look at each other. We can assume Gilliam is closer to the Montaros than he is. Bassander Lin begins to ask Hadrian about what he's doing on Imesh, if he's been on Imesh long. And on the page specifically, the narrator writes Bassander and then corrects himself and then says Lieutenant Lin, not in conversation, but like as he's writing the account. I just picked it up. It's on page 362. And he's like, have you been on Imesh long? Asked Bassander - Lieutenant Lin, I should say. So that small note should give us an indication that this relationship is not just some random officer to Hadrian. There is a relationship, good or bad, we don't know yet, antagonistic or friendly, but so much that he would correct himself from calling him the first name and then give his more formal title.
Yeah, it suggests there's some like familiarity that is not at this point in the story, but will later be, because he's sort of correcting in the moment that at this time he was Lieutenant Lin. Yeah. Although he knows him now as Bassander Lin. That's a good catch.
He looking at Bassander Lin, he is clean shaven, so he doesn't have his facial hair lasered off.
Right.
So it tells us something about him. And although he looks this part of belonging at this table, the vibe he is giving off is he'd rather be anywhere else but here. So he's observing every politeness, he's observing all the manners, but you could tell that this guy belongs more on the front lines than he does with the politicking of soldiery.
Yeah, not super happy to be here. Not at all.
Then we get this interesting foreshadowing lore drop of Bassander Lin and Hadrian's relationship that I wanted to read on 362. You have heard no doubt that we met as rivals and fought a duel for the command of our army. It is not so that we would fight in time. No, I met the Phoenix at the table one quiet evening in Borisivo. Bassander Lin, my last friend, my enemy, hero of the rout at Perfugium, where Hadrian half-mortal failed. Veteran of 100 battles, knight, captain, traitor. He would be all of those things, but not yet. That night, he was only a dinner guest, as was I. So we get like a mini chapter 1 for Bassander Lin as a character.
Yes. This stuck out to me so brightly when I first read this book. This was the first time where Hadrian narrator like spoils something where I was like, I was immediately interested with this plot device of giving us information before we know it. You know, we get a lot of that information at the start of the book, and that sort of carries us through this book with expectation. But this carries a lot of expectation with this specific character. So from here on out, I just am remembering every time I see Bassander's name anywhere, I'm just constantly like, what is it? What happens? Like, what happens that we go from this nonchalant, casual discussion to all of the, I mean, how does that possibly happen? I also appreciate when Hadrian in this section talks to the audience in world about, you've heard this legend and that is not true. It actually happened this small way. He did this previously with his introduction to the Cielson for the first time, where he's saying, you know, like, I've heard so many stories of how I met a Cielson for the first time. And it was actually in this like dungeon, funny enough. It wasn't like a big mythical moment. It was just me having a conversation with this thing. It's similar with Bassander. It suggests that this character is so important, not just for Hadrian, but to the narrative of what Hadrian is, that there would be a mythos surrounding Bassander Lin. So gonna be like probably a key component somewhere in the mix here, a friend, foe, whatever. Bassander's very clearly going to be a big deal moving forward.
Yeah. So we will encounter, we know by this, no spoilers, we will encounter Bassander Lin at least once more in the story.
Correct.
It sounds like more. So let's break down this sort of mini chapter on for like this foreshadowing section for Bassander Lin. One, he calls him the Phoenix at the table. So this military person that has enough notoriety to warrant a nickname, and that nickname is the Phoenix. So what do we know about a Phoenix? A Phoenix rises from the ashes and is born anew. Apparently they dueled. The myth that he is demythifying is that they dueled for command of the army. So there's some mythical struggle for a military force between these two.
In the language, at least in my version, it says fought a duel for the command of our army. It's almost, it suggests that they share command somehow over a military component. So they have an army at some point, or the legend says so, and they are at odds for some reason and fighting over who should be in charge of said military unit.
It says our army in this version too, but it also says immediately afterwards, right, this didn't happen. So we know that they don't duel for the command of the army, but it also says, though we would fight in time. So at some point, we know there will be a fight between Hadrian and Bassander Lin. He calls him my last friend and my enemy. So we also can tell by that there was a antagonistic relationship and a friendly relationship
at some point.
And so we need to keep an eye out for how that goes bad, or potentially. We also hear of this battle at Perfugium where Bassander Lin was the hero and Hadrian failed miserably. The Hadrian half-mortal, a nickname that we heard in chapter 1, failed. So where Hadrian fails, Bassander succeeds in this particular case at this battle that we can assume is pretty well known in the history of the empire. He's also called a knight. So he gets elevated from lieutenant to knighthood and to captainship, right? So he gets elevated beyond his current station. And then the last thing that he calls him is a traitor.
To who?
So we can assume that when he's my enemy, that there's a betrayal aspect of Bassander Lin in his relationship with Hadrian,
or to the empire. We like,
or to the empire.
So like, who knows? It's all up in the air here. We just don't have enough information. But it's Thrakia saying like, hey, here's a machine gun of question marks, and chew on that for a while. Every time I mention this character on the page, it's once again wonderful because it gives us things to chew on and things to look forward to and to be excited for in each moment. You know, like, you know, he has this emphasis on wanting people to be on each page rather than looking towards the end. And funnily enough, this gives us something to look for on each page as we see the character. Like, are we seeing a growing friendship? Are we seeing the treachery before it happens? So we get to sort of spot in the moment before maybe even Hadrian in the story knows it, of how does this come to pass? So it's a sort of a brilliant technique to do so. He tells us out of the gate, but then we also get to experience it each moment, looking for the things that he's mentioned.
I mean, chapter 1 is my favorite part of this entire book, probably. And the fact that we get some similar language around Bassander Lin is also awesome.
Yes.
This is not a spoiler. I love the character of Bassander Lin. And we know that he shows up later in the series. Bassander Lin is one of the best written characters on the page throughout the entire series. And so when we meet and hang out with him, we need to keep an eye on and tie back to chapter 53 in
Yes.
Empire of Silence and how this is all set up. Hadrian gives him the line that he is, Hadrian Gibson of Tucros, and, just tries to obfuscate from the reality of the situation. He's actually Palatine and whatever. And then flips it on Bassander Lin and asks about his service in the Legion. He notes that Bassander Lin is drinking water, and so he's not, this military officer sort of sees himself as on duty. We don't know if that it's like a religious reason, but regardless, Bassander Lin is treating this as if he's at work. He doesn't want to be drunk on the job. He says that he's been on active duty, meaning awake, for 18 years, ship time, but nearly 200 years total service to the Legion if he counts fugue. So these are the scales. We're starting to get a picture of what military service looks like in a galactic empire, right? Bassander mentions that he once knew a centurion who enlisted under an emperor 1,200 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And presumably that guy was in fugue for the majority of that time.
And this is, I think, one of the most interesting parts of like the military in the sort of Solon Empire universe here that Rocchio's created, is that there are, you can imagine as a consequence of this, you can picture legions full in ships asleep for centuries between engagements as they travel across the stars or before they're not needed at some time. You can, if you're picturing the idea of a centurion being alive on ice at various times for a total of 1,200 years, I mean, you're talking about like somebody going to sleep, waking up to a universe they no longer know, engaging in a combat, going to sleep again for another 200 years, coming back, and the world is different again, and their waking moments are nothing but military service in between gigantic spans of time. It's a sort of special kind of hell that it sounds like. Very, very interesting. I've not experienced a science fiction book describing this precise thing before, and I really like it. It's one of the most interesting things in this universe. There's some short story stuff sort of centered around all of these shenanigans with people being asleep and stuff like that, so that we'll get into it another time. But it's really interesting. It has a lot of implications for what it's like to be a soldier in this universe.
There's also a guild factionarius on the other side of the table who like drip feeds us some lore about, and her wife are sitting next to each other, and they chime in, and it's like, oh, it's, basically we find out some more that conscripts serve 20 years active duty. So, and Bassander Lin is presumably there of his own will. He's not a conscript, but he would be close to the end of what would look like a normal military contract, right?
Like a tour.
18 years, a tour or whatever before you re-enlist or apply or whatever. So he's ending the first section of his military career presumably soon.
Yeah.
When Valka hears all this, she's, whispering to herself that these are just a bunch of barbarians, because to her, standing armies are anathema, because we get some more world building about Tavros, the Tavros Demarchy, that what keeps the peace in the Demarchy between the clans is technology that is world ending, planetary annihilation, mutually assured destruction between these clans. And the quote here is, to Valka, it was preferable that all men might die than any man did. This sort of gives us a window into our own current situation in the world. Now, that being said, the world is on fire at this very moment, and it looks like we're inching towards midnight on the atomic clock. But that's the deterrence that keeps Tavros together and in peace is the sort of nuclear option, or whatever the technological equivalent at this age is, compared to a legion that is constantly at war or suppressing rebellion across the entirety of the galaxy.
Something that's mentioned as well near this section that really jumped out at me, I don't know how I missed this. I'm actually curious if it's still in your version. After the section they're talking about the 20-year terms, Hadrian says the change to lifetime service had only occurred recently, sort of suggesting that there is lifetime service in the military among conscripts at this point in time. And it sounds like at least that many of the houses of Palatine opposed the change. And Hadrian said that if he was able to, he would have opposed the change as well, which is like a massive change. It sort of drops off the page to me from the 20-year term to lifetime. It just seems like completely crazy, maybe suggest how desperate the war is getting that they would make such a change. It's 20 years is harsh enough, but the idea that it would be a lifetime is crazy. It's page 363.
Yeah, it's still here. The change to lifetime service had occurred only recently. Yeah. That also tells you how the war's going, right? The war must be going poorly if they're having to change everything to lifetime service.
Against what many Palatine houses would be okay with, which seems sort of interesting. Like, thus far, we sort of got this like very hierarchical discussion about like, the Palatine almost being like almost comically cruel sometimes. And the Palatine, it sounds like, are like, yo, like many people are against that. It sounds like it's almost something that's been forced upon the empire.
Well, if you think about it too, from a Palatine familial perspective, only one of the children is going to inherit the station. And all of the other children are either going to end up becoming scholiasts or going to the Chantry or being part of the Legion. So we can assume that those that are wanting to serve in the Legion, at least temporarily, and then, do with their inheritance or fortune for the next 600 years or whatever it may be, are pretty upset at the idea that they're going to have to use their entire expanded lifespan to serve for this war.
Crazy. Yeah, totally crazy.
Lin then directs a question to Valka and says, he inquires, he could tell her accent is Tevrosi, and politely, which is rare, right? We should note the fact that he's being polite to this woman as a character moment for him, because normally people treat Tevrosi, we find out, more aggressively, like we saw Gilliam do previously.
Yep.
She says, yes, he mentions that his ship and his service was loaned out to a Tavrosi company during these events called the Mathurin campaigns that Hadrian doesn't know anything about as the narrator, and thus we don't know anything about, because I looked it up and I couldn't find anything other than it was a series of battles between two Tavrosi clans that the Imperials aided with. And that this particular military engagement ended in an armistice very shortly after the Cielcen appeared on the outer edge, because bigger fish were to fry. So when the Cielcen started attacking the edge of the galaxy, this campaign ended. Hadrian is looking for a way to insert, now that he's talking to his girl, like Bassander Lin's talking to his girl or whatever, he's trying to insert himself into the conversation, but can't find a way in. Bassander Lin is being extremely polite and calls Valka my lady, and then she corrects him and calls him doctor. Says, call me doctor, I'm not a lady. And then he's asking why she's there, and she explains, I'm here because of the Xenobites. That's my area of study. And then the moment that happens, Elomas perks up.
Yep.
He's having a conversation with the Logothete on the side. And then he asks Bassander Lin if he's seen the Umand. And then they continue in that vein for a little bit longer. And to Hadrian, finally, that bit of the conversation ends. Bassander then directs conversation back to him and asks what Hadrian is doing here. At which point, Hadrian formally introduces himself as Hadrian Gibson. And then Elomas Hadrian, to be clear, Hadrian in both situations on Delos and in Imesh does not break the ice with the Cielcen conversation. At the beginning of the story, it was Crispin asking if they were cannibals. Here, it's Elomas mentioning the fact that Hadrian speaks Cielcen that brings the Cielcen up. But we know something about Hadrian. The moment the Cielcen got brought up, he's not going to stop talking about him.
Yep.
Lin is visibly surprised at Hadrian being able to speak Cielcen.
Yep.
Now, in comparison to the beginning of the book where Hadrian was showing off his language and being proud of his study of the Cielcen, despite the fact that it is weird, he keeps an eye out for the Chantry in this situation. So there's a learning moment.
Yeah, he's more politically savvy. He chooses not to go way off the road with it.
So he turns down his volume and then he explains, I can speak Cielcen. Then the guild factionaries leans in is asking, why do you speak Cielcen? He bites back a potential melodramatic remark, but then gives his alibi and honestly just says, well, I'm just good at languages. Everything I learn, it just seems to stick up there, even the Cielcen tongue. And that although he does speak Cielcen, he come to Imesh hoping to learn the Umand language, but that seems impossible. The factionaries' wife is, the moment Cielcen talk is coming up, she's making the sign of the sun disk. She's very pious and is calling them demons. Hadrian's like, I don't know if they're demons.
And we've stepped into
now we've crossed the line.
Yes. It's as if there's two things going on here, I think. Number one, the black and white discussion about the Cielson is a trigger point for him. He can't help
Yep.
himself. Even with the increased political savviness, he cannot help but comment on the fact that he thinks that there's more going on with the Cielson than the rest of the Empire seems to think. And also, Valka's at the dinner. And I think that that is influencing his desire to allow comments like this to be made. It's going to continue to influence this conversation, in my view. When we were previously observing the discussion between Valka and Hadrian in the last episode, one of the things that we noticed was that he believes that if you're able to say something about injustice or something like that, you should do it. You should volunteer this thing. He's very much trying to evidence to her that he is different than everybody else, and that if you have the ability to talk about the differences, you should do so. And I think we see that ethics starting to play out here at this dinner in part because he simply can't pull himself back once things cross a certain line.
I didn't think about that when reading this section, but you're 100% right. The fact that Valka is here is extremely important and probably why this line of questioning continues longer than it potentially should from a safety standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
The factionarius cuts Hadrian off and excuses, oh, my wife is so pious, blah, blah, blah. Please continue. Hadrian mentions that, at least as it relates to my ability with languages, I've always considered it an investment in the future. And Bassander Lin is sort of taken aback. What do you mean an investment in the future? Hadrian, echoing what Director Fang says, the Mandari businesswoman at the very beginning of the book, she says the war can't go on forever. And at the end, somebody's going to have to be able to speak with the Cielson, if only to secure their surrender. And this is where now we have crossed the line even further into heresy. Hadrian thinks that the factionarius was trying to interrupt him for some other reason, but really what we find out is she sees Ligeia come up behind the head of the Chantry, come up behind Hadrian, grip the back of his table, and says surrender when he says if only to secure the surrender. And on 365, I will read this section. Where is it? Surrender. At the sound of that voice behind me, I knew the woman across from me had not been about to argue, but to warn me. Ligeia Vass stood, witch shadow stooped by time, resplendent in robes of Terran black, her thick white braid twice wrapped around her shoulders. In her face, I saw echoes of Gilliam. Those two blue eyes, frozen as distant stars, were identical to Gilliam's one. Whence his black eye came, I never learned, nor did I care to. The features that were him in a twisted parody of humankind looked finely chiseled as if from marble in the Grand Prior's time-folded features. We do not want their surrender. That said, she addressed the entire segment of the high table, speaking loudly enough to reach Lords Balian and Luther in their matching high-backed chairs. The Cielson must be wiped from the face of our galaxy, purged. She slipped them into the guise of a preacher, total and absolute. In the cantos it is written, go out into the dark and subdue it, and make for your dominion all that is there, and will bend you to you. So it is written, thou shalt not suffer demons to live. So whereas last time his father interjected at the potential of heresy, we get a high-ranking member of the Chantry now interject in Hadrian's comments about the Cielson and basically accuse him of heresy to his face.
Extremely serious. I mean, and just for a quick reminder, Gilliam's mom, Gilliam, bad news, this lady gives me the vibe that she is bad news extra large, not good to be. This is different than just mouthing off in front of dad. This is mouthing off in front of the faction that glasses planets. This is this is very, very serious stuff. This is a record scratch moment for the whole table and dinner, in my view. Everything stops. The waiters probably stop in place as this person starts talking.
Not to mention the fact that in comparison to him and his antagonism with Gilliam, Gilliam's an Intis.
Yes.
And so even though he's a member of the Chantry and has some semblance of power, his nature limits him from advancement to some extent, right?
Yep.
We know that in so many words. His mom is a Palatine, and although maybe the fact that she had an Intis limits her from a standpoint, she's the high prior of an entire planet, and you could assume is like a bishop, right? Is pretty high up in the Chantry. This is the highest official that Hadrian has directly interacted with since basically the woman on Delos, and maybe even higher than her, or the equivalent at the very least. She mentions a few things. In the cantos, it is written, go out in the dark and subdue it. I think the cantos, it means songs, but I think the cantos, the name of the cantos is a reference to Hyperion, like the Hyperion cantos. And she says right there on his bookshelf, as you can see in the upper right for those who are watching us, she also says, thou shalt not suffer demons to live, in which Hadrian says and claps back to him, I'm pretty sure it's not that way. And that's from this old ancient cult, by the way, the ancient cult that he's referring to, this adorator cult that still exists in portions of the old empire, is either Judaism or Christianity, because this is a line taken from the Old Testament, and it's talking about witches or sorceresses, not about demons. Exodus 22:18 in the King James Version says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. It's sorceress in the ESV version of the Bible. And at this, Valka smiles because she also hears him clap back against the Chantry, but funny enough, she's being called a witch by the Chantry before as well.
Yes, and once again, I think this is partly what influences Hadrian here. The fact that she's across from him to smile at him when he does something like this, it sort of emboldens him in a way. This is, for all the pretty girl smiling at you about making the clap at thing, this is genuinely dangerous. This is not this is not casual at all. But I think that's partly what impresses Valka in some sense, is that he is being willing to speak what he believes to be truth to a very dangerous power here, not just in private, where it's easy to do so, but in a public setting as well. So he is risking himself here, but I do think he is also winning genuine points with her because he's willing to not toe the line like everybody else is in this dangerous situation.
She then recognizes him, probably did in advance, but mentions it that you are the one that Gilliam has warned me about, the demon-tongued one, meaning that he can speak the Cielcen tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrator mentions she was the first to call Hadrian this, but definitely not the last. So we know that his speaking of the Cielcen tongue is going to get him in more trouble later in the story. She begins speaking to him in classical English, like reciting this portion of Exodus to him in classical English. And that's where we get the drip-fed world building that apparently there are still some Jews or Christians in some older parts of the empire that still practice. Because Hadrian has read the Old Testament and presumably the New Testament as well. And these adorator cults still exist, but are not the main. Obviously, they're not the Chantry. He claps back at her, cuts her off in classical English and says, I know what it says. And that's like a pin drop moment of like, this guy's well read. He actually knows the languages. And at this point, whereas another Alistair Balian contrasting moment, Alistair would cut Hadrian off and say, apologize at this moment. Balian cuts Hadrian off and steps in to try and de-escalate the situation, laughing and saying, like, look how talented this guy is at languages. Now you understand why I have him teaching my kids, because he's very, very good. She then, Ligeia says that, so you were a slave in Colosso, to which Dorian, the son, and presumably potentially one of the heirs of the Mataro throne, corrects her politely and says, no, ma'am, he was actually a Myrmidon that went into the pool willingly.
I think what's important about this specific line too is I think she's perceptive like Gilliam. And I think she is saying like, this was a slave. Like something about this is not making sense. This person is here and you're telling me was a slave in Colosso and speaks classical English and knows the Bible verse I'm referencing. Mm-hmm. Just the logic of what's happening doesn't make sense. And so she's right to be suspicious of this. And even with the clarification that he was a Myrmidon, it still doesn't add up. Something is off.
100%. And so now she is being inquisitorial with him as well. So if we're to take a step back and look at this situation, Hadrian has already failed at his ostensible thing. Even though Balian's trying to change the subject of the conversation or whatever, the whole point of his alibi and things like that is to avoid being caught by the Chantry, because that could have impacts for the entirety of the House Mataro, right? Was what we learned. If they find out that he has left a potential post on Vesperad. He's already caught the attention of the two highest ranking Chantry officials on this planet, and they do not like him. Hadrian looks up the table to see Gilliam smile at his mother barking him down, and not wanting to give any, like I think he says, never let him see you bleed, not wanting to give any weakness away to the enemy, smiles back at Gilliam. As Ligeia accuses Hadrian of being a witch or for speaking the Cielcen tongue, to which he replies, I prefer the term magus if it's all the same to you, which is joking, but at the same time, like, he kind of wants to be the Magus, right? We very early on in like Distant Thunder, he's talking about this insatiable desire, like his desire to understand the Cielson tongue is for him to learn this arcane thing and to get treasures and to learn to be this mythical sort of Merlin Arthurian hero, right?
Yeah.
Sid Arthurian hero.
It's really interesting. When I was reading this section again, it was really jumping out at me that sword fights are overrated. And what I mean by that is sword fights are great, but this is just as like tense and sparry, so to speak, as any sword fight, this discussion. And, Hadrian did too much in this conversation, overextended himself, but he is sort of taking the strategy, like at this point, the only way forward to safety is through. And so rather than backing off, he de-escalates the situation by making a joke, which triggers Dolomas to laugh. It sort of cracks through the sort of frozen room that has been developed into this dangerous position in a similar way to where he, cracks a joke with Gen in Colosso to sort of switch things up in order to make things okay. He's sort of done a similar thing. He's using his charisma to force his way through awkward situations to where, previously when he tries to pick Gen up off the floor, Gen has to, in order to win socially, Gen has to crack a joke and get up. And in this situation now, he sort of switched the momentum of the conversation such that it actually makes her look silly for continuing to press him this hard after the room has started laughing. So he's pushed his way through the political situation in sort of a really delicate way. It actually would be weird for her to continue pressing at this point. So very smart, charismatic strategy here, frankly. If he was going to break social convention, at least he is doing it in a competent way, and he's made his way through safely.
There are two modes that Hadrian has in fighting and in rhetoric when he is faced with an opponent. And this is mode one, the one that's more elegant, the Zorro-esque mode that he had with Crispin. He knows how to get under somebody's skin, and he's going to redirect their momentum in a way that allows him to win and use his quickness, his quick-wittedness to put them in a situation where they lose, right? And have them fall over, hoisted on their own petard. Then the other mode that we see is when he gets too angry, then it's, I'm going to murder you and I'm going to strike first and strike fast. So we haven't gotten to that point quite yet, but this is, you're right. Sword fights are overrated. We could tell a lot about Hadrian in his rhetorical battles as much as his physical battles, because that's exactly what's happening here. Back to what you were saying about Elomas, he mentions that Hadrian has some real stones on him to be able to have this conversation with the Chantry right now.
Yes.
Ligeia warns him, still feeling the ice may have been broken around the table, and people are like, who is this guy talking to this woman this way? She's still cold and still a statue, to which Hadrian turns on the faux politeness, right? Says the right things, using the right terms, calling her your reverence, and giving himself an out and an exit while being polite, but still is using some terminology just enough to be defined. He's just towing the edge of the line.
Yep.
Then Valka tries to be polite to Ligeia, but then asks if, like, you interrupted him. He was going to tell a story before you interrupted. And then, of course, this is the one moment that Hadrian gets flustered. It's because he can't remember what he was going to say, but also, like, Valka is wanting to hear a story for him. And now he's only thinking about her. Here's where it gets really interesting. She recites in the exact tone and cadence the precise conversation that they were having earlier. You were going to say, and then, like, almost repeats it back to him word for word in the same exact cadence, which tells us that Valka has some sort of photographic memory or some way of recalling that is extraordinary that we haven't seen before. He was going to tell the story about how Gibson was showing him some Cielson warrior hollows to the guild factionaries and his wife. But in a learning moment, he thinks better of it. And he comes up with a story on the fly about his uncle Ronan, who we know is not actually his uncle, who took him to see some animals fight on this planet, a snake and a mongoose. And somebody asked what a mongoose is, and he explains, because they didn't have mongooses on that planet. And he begged his uncle to let him bet on the fight, like he's going to bet on the snake. He bet a whole week's allowance or month's allowance or however much it was on the snake, because he could tell the snake is like venomous. It's going to win. It looks more dangerous on the surface. And the mongoose is just some mammal over there. Like, why would it ever win?
Right.
And then he, in a call and response moment, is like, can anybody guess who won? So we get some of the storytelling elements that makes Hadrian a good storyteller here. Nobody answers, but then Elon Musk pipes up and says the snake won. And he was like, the odds were that it would, right? It has fangs, it has poison, but in reality, the mongoose won. So what's the moral of the story here? Tiger can't change its stripes. Mongooses have always been good at hunting snakes, or so good any good student of literature would know. You can never be sure which men are snakes and which are mongooses, not until one bites you. And then we'll lead the end of the chapter in a very, very good moment here. But or any good student of literature would know, I think, is referencing the fact that there is a story in Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book called Rikki Tikki Tavi, which is an older story that is a bastardization of a even older Indian continental story about a mongoose who protects from snakes, right? So I think it's a direct reference to Kipling in this moment, and the fact that Hadrian has probably read Kipling.
I really like this moment where there's a discussion about part of the reason the mongoose wins is because the owner has done something to it such that it won't die from the poison from the snake. And there's a discussion about how he says, the owner cheats. And so the owner is this kind of snake. And with men, you don't know if they're snake or mongoose, and not until you bite or they bite. And there's this idea that with people, you don't get to see what kind of person someone is until some action happens, essentially. I don't think that the irony is lost on the fact that he's speaking about whether or not people are snakes with this Chantry lady behind him. It's noted that Valka is smiling as he makes this comment. Once again, displaying his speaking truth to power, but just enough underneath the surface as to not be, this social strategy, right, of being just frustrating enough to where if the person you're jabbing gets upset, you get to act like they're the one who's acting unreasonable for being upset. So just like a small verbal dagger once again. And in a funny way, it seems like the priest actually appreciates it in a sense, because she's sort of consumes her frustration and comments, "You would make a good priest."
Yeah, let's read that last section. It's so good.
Yeah.
Silence floated like smoke, punctuated by the soft strains of harp and viola. Somehow the music enhanced the quiet more than broke it. After a moment, I tore my gaze from the star-eyed prior and focused on my plate. Valka was smiling at me, the lone candle flame in a sea of ashen faces. By that token, I decided the whole gambit had been worth it, whatever else happened. The band, true soldiers, had not missed a note through that awful quietude. Then the Count laughed, a pounding, empty tumbler against the tabletop of raucous applause. A proper talent indeed, it would seem, Reverence Voss, that we must not mistake of considering the Myrmidon a fool. With kneading motions, the Grand Prior tightened the rope of uncut white hair around her time-weighted shoulders. Her nostrils flared, but she smiled, paying me what doubtless she believed a fine compliment. You would make a good priest. This is confirmation from a high-up Chantry official saying that he would be a good priest. So not only did Gibson say this, but now a member of the Chantry says this too, because of his grasp of rhetoric, his ability to speak the Salesan language, obviously as an inquisitor would be important. Everything we know about Hadrian is he would make a good member of the Chantry if he were pious.
Yes, he's just hates the idea of it and won't do it for ethical reasons and for living out his own dream reasons. But yeah, he basically everyone other than Valka's told him he would be a good priest at this point. Like his dad, Gibson, this person. I mean, it's pretty amazing.
It's one thing for them to say it, for a high prior, for the head of the Chantry on a planet, and presumably the second most powerful person on the planet, right next to the Mataros.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
It's also a concession that she lost too, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, but she maintains composure in an effort to sort of make do with the loss, right? If she loses it, then she loses more. But because she maintains composure, she gets to keep her dignity in this situation.
And that's where we end chapter 53 and begin with chapter 54, Gaslight. So after this rhetorical victory, Hadrian is definitely feeling himself as he's walking over the palace. This moment, beyond the fact that he's just here and came out of nowhere, has now given him some notoriety beyond what he had before. People know who he is now after this event. He also mentions that a new place is similar to a pair of shoes that needs to be broken. It's very apt metaphor here. That, you know, at the beginning, you don't feel necessarily comfortable. It kind of hurts. It sucks. But the moment that you get broken in and you get more familiar, it gets more comfortable. And so even though he's in this gilded cage, he has now found a rhythm in his limited freedom that is comfortable for him, is what he's saying. And that even if he gets bored tutoring with the Mataros, his evenings with Valka are worth it. So he's just falling for this girl, dude, falling so hard. He also notes that in his conversations with Valka, he is trying to be more measured with his joking about the Chantry, but Valka is not. Like, Valka is more like, do you hear how they, you know, like, is still bringing up the fact that his dinner and all this different stuff. And they're laughing about it in their conversations in her rooms, to which he responds that he loves her laugh. He says she laughed like a storm cloud. He sort of revels in her unladylikeness, right? Like, he loves the fact that she is wild and not beholden to the same social standards. He also likes that there's mystery to her, that he doesn't understand everything, that she's exotic for him in comparison to the ladies that he would have been more interested. We get more world building stuff around Tavrosian courts because they tend to complicate things. They have a reputation of being disliked, mainly because of what we're seeing here, right? She doesn't have a sense of propriety to not joke about the Chantry. And so when we saw Bassander Lin in the previous chapter be polite, extremely polite to her, that's a rarity. Normally, people don't like having Tavrosi around because if you do anything to one, you do them to all of them. Gives them this sort of ability to be more frustrating and not have to care about social mores where everybody else really does. The masks that are not visible are still on at all times in court, and Tavrosi just don't have to wear them. As he is walking towards his room, he is in this sort of antechamber, like yard area that gas lights are lighting along the walkway. And he notes that this isn't just opulence, although it would be opulence for them to use this just to burn the fossil fuel because they had it. There's also a practical purpose in that if the blackouts occur and the lights flicker, the lamps still guide people towards exits, towards rooms or whatever. So the practical purpose is that they're used during the blackouts. He mentions that he has met again with Polino since the last time that we saw Polino at the gate.
Just drops that in the middle of the page, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it suggested that they're still continuing to take the plan seriously of getting off world with a ship. So, like, this is sort of, you know, narrator and Rockio telling us, you know, just because I haven't shown you on the page, like this thing is still happening and it's continuing, which is, once again, a good efficiency of writing. It's something I appreciate about Rockio, is that he doesn't have to show everything for us to know that there are plot elements happening in the story. We don't have to see it all the time. We can skip time and stuff, and things still continue to move.
We do find out, though, that Polino has signed up for another term, and that Switch will also probably do so to make more money, because otherwise the timing wouldn't necessarily work for both of them to stay in line with each other, because Polino seems to be on a different timeline than Switch does. But they want to be able to earn more money to make this plan even more successful. But at the same time, they're exposing themselves to danger, and that makes Hadrian nervous because he doesn't have the control of the situation. But he thinks, like, there's still hope for this plan to work, right? In his mind right now, he's still wanting this plan to succeed. And so does Polino, and so does Switch. So maybe we're moving towards reconciliation in that relationship as well, although we haven't seen it on screen yet. Despite his cage, he feels content rarely. Like, this is the first time of contentedness since being in this gilded cage, minus the sort of guilty glad that I'm not fighting for my life in Colosso anymore. Now, with that post-dinner moment, he has some sort of freedom. I imagine a big part of him feeling safe and comfortable is the fact that not only the hope of this plan working, but also his budding relationship with Valka. Because he mentions that he hopes that Valka will join him if this plan succeeds, to go and travel the world and travel the galaxy and see Xenobites, because it's exactly what he wants.
Yeah, you can sort of see, like, he's got this this vision for the future developing, right? He's got this picture perfect scenario where his friends will, work out and they'll all get on a ship together, and then Valka will join them, and then they'll all like go off into the stars together, and it'll be this like wonderful, perfect thing. It sounds really cool. The difficulty sometimes with this kind of thing is when you start to invest in the future in this way, it generates excitement and motivation, but it also can generate expectations to fall short of. So it's kind of a complex thing to think about in terms of what makes sense here for Hadrian, if it's hoping too high or if it's just forming a good plan.
And as he is ruminating on all these thoughts and crossing this courtyard with these gas lamps around him, he hears a voice yell, "Boy!" at him. And as he's about to reach the door to the hall that has his rooms inside of it, Gilliam Voss is there calling out to him, and then like runs up on him essentially and backs him into the nearest gas lamppost and begins berating Hadrian to his face, saying, "How dare you speak to my mother that way?" And as he's doing this, Hadrian smells his breath, and it smells sweet or like mint or some sort of drug, like stimulant, that he has been using, or potentially both. Maybe this is going back to that handkerchief.
Yeah.
And this is some drip fed, last time it was coffee or cinnamon. Now it's sweet or mint, or potentially like this Verox stimulant or something like that. So clearly Gilliam is on some sort of drugs, either to help with his condition or as a crutch. We don't know, but Hadrian can smell it on his breath. And even despite the fact that he's like pushed it back into this lamp thing, he just claps back at Gilliam and his mother saying, well, the words of this tutor really getting to you, man. You must be really, really fragile. At which point Gilliam pushes him and Hadrian hits his head and does a little squawk, calls him a plutocrat. Like, if you weren't like so close to the Mataro children, if the Count didn't protect you, I would have you killed. My family is so old. You have no idea. And is putting himself on this Palatine pedestal above Hadrian, not knowing that him saying his family is old is nothing. Like, we know Hadrian is one of the emperor's own peerage, meaning that he has a direct line connecting him to the emperor himself, a distant cousin.
He can't reveal it, right? Like, he's in this weird position where he has position over Gilliam, but he can't use it, because to do so would expose him to scrutiny and he would be discovered immediately. And revealing it to Gilliam, of all people, is super bad. Like he's going to reveal that he's this person that he was supposed to go to the I mean, like, it's like an impossible situation. He has to pretend to have less leverage than he does.
But he's still, in his nonverbal communication, is indicating that he is more important than Gilliam thinks he is. Because every single time Gilliam talks about his blood or whatever, Hadrian then, like, even though he's short for a Palatine, he mentions, that's when he stands tall and is like, look at me. He doesn't say this in his words, but in his nonverbal communication, puffing out his chest and like, look at my beautiful features and my purple eyes, dude. That should give you an indication. If you're so interested in the Palatine, maybe you should know a little bit more about their houses, because I am like, you think your house is old. Mine is super old. And he remarks that the fact that Gilliam not knowing it is surprising to him, because he should know just based on looking at Hadrian that he is. Then again, he says it's probably because I'm a little shorter than expected. Hadrian then says, well, I mean, you guys really started it. I mean, your mom started it when she interrupted a personal story of mine, and you're doing this now as I'm literally walking to bed. So, I mean, you're asking for it. I'm not wanting to introduce anything into here. You guys are the ones who are coming up on me, and I'm just defending myself. Yeah, they are instigating. And this, again, is making Gilliam even more angry. Hadrian can see, exactly like with Crispin, he knows how to get under people's skin. And he pulls Hadrian so close that in the night air, Hadrian can see this well-applied cosmetics and makeup begin running because it's so hot. And he lets Hadrian go only to backhand him with a ringed hand. Hadrian mentions, oh, shoot, man, this guy's from Mimesh. Like, that hurt. That actually hurt.
Yeah, this is the moment, I think, where we as the reader start to realize this is getting, like, really serious. There are consequences to Hadrian's actions. If Hadrian just gets to be brazen all the time and nothing happens, then it sort of teaches us that there's no consequences to things. Gilliam is this consequence, and it is not funny. Like, he is strong, he is scary, and he is getting more unhinged as Hadrian pushes harder. Like, this is not an endless say whatever you want situation at all. And Gilliam is making that very, very clear right now. He needs to be careful how hard he pushes.
And he's a physical threat too. Like, even though he is an Intis and he is not as pretty or whatever, this is the first time Hadrian remarks. I mean, he kind of accosted him earlier with the Ciels and stuff, but after getting hit by him, he's like, oh, this guy spent his entire life on a planet that has harsher gravity than mine. So there's some strength behind this wound that I've just sustained. And that, like, is a note for Hadrian, but he also begins downloading Gilliam's tactics because of it and adjusting. He knows that he has to use his superior speed if he's going to fight back in any situation with Gilliam. Gilliam then feints another, like fakes another slap, and Hadrian like flinches instinctively, much to his own chagrin, because he's like, oh crap, I showed weakness there. And then Gilliam sort of wryly smiles and then sticks out his chin to Hadrian, his hands behind his back, knowing that if Hadrian were to strike him, he would be in deep trouble, like very bad trouble. And at that, Gilliam mentions to him on page 373, Gilliam's smile did not falter, and he said, ah, you can learn. You see, this is not the Colosso Myrmidon. We expect civility at court, and no matter how well-trained Balian thinks you are, a half-savage is a half-savage. Blood tells all. And he responds, your reverence is an expert on half-savages, surely. I was careful to enunciate the half, inclining my head to reference his condition. It is good of you to stoop to my level, and such dedication. Tell me, were you born thus, or did you pay a bone cutter to better relate to such as me? Not for the first time I wondered at the fire in the man, the hatred. Was it that his deformity spurred him to act twice as viciously in his role as Palatine and priest? Or was it only that he saw in me someone beneath him? Was he what all Palatines looked at to the plebs? Is this what Switch saw in me? There's a lot there.
Yeah, well, yeah. What a second. First of all, your reference is an expert on half savages is crazy.
Oh my gosh,
that's crazy. Like, that is like, talk about poking the bull. Like holy, like that is like.
If he can't hit back, he could talk back at least.
He can talk back, but I mean, like, he is riling this guy up to just smack the crap out of him. I mean, this is continuing to play with fire even amidst this. Once again, sword fights are overrated. He can stab with words hard, man, like just intensely. And then once again, we're getting, this continued commentary about what generated the cruelty of Gilliam, about whether or not it was how he always treated, if there's some sort of moral reflection of his physical condition, or if he just is this person regardless of his genetic heritage. It's hard to know. We just know his behavior. His behavior is that he's cruel regardless of the source of it. So it's hard to know sources sometimes, but we can't describe his behavior. It's too far. But in fairness, Hadrian is egging on and making it worse at this point.
But he also mentions the condescension that Gilliam has is one. He says it's ironic because I'm a true Palatine and one of the Emperor's own peers, and this Intis is looking down on me. But he's also saying, like, is it because he is Palatine or priest or cruel that he has this condescension, or is this like a nature of being Palatine? And is this what Switch sees when he hears, is this what Switch was thinking when he found out that I was a Palatine? An interesting moment of introspection.
Yeah, does he see this like monster underneath that Gilliam is just supposed to be like a physical portrayal of? It's a moment of self-reflection for Hadrian, and sometimes being treated a particular way is how we gain insight for how we treat other people. And so it's possible that him being treated in this cruel way by sort of, even though it's an Intis, maybe gives him a little bit more insight of what it's like, what maybe Switch experienced at the hands of the Palatine in some sense, and so he has increased empathy for it. So
100%. No, yeah, that's exactly what it has to be. Because even in his dealings with Palatine at this point, like Bailey and Matarowitz ostensibly, or any of his kids, could treat Hadrian this way, and they have not.
Yeah,
and they've treated him as a guest. We don't know what their aims are with having Hadrian be a tutor or whatever. We have some indications that it seems that Anais is kind of obsessed with him a little bit, but we don't know anything more than that. And they haven't like beaten him. But presumably they could have license to do that and get away with it because of the fact that he is a patrician at best, or a plutocrat or whatever. Their station could give them the liberty to do that. And this is the first time Hadrian has experienced at the hands of a Palatine what cruelty looks like. And so he probably thinks not only about Switch, but probably about Crispin or this is the behavior that he has been against since the very beginning.
Yeah.
Gilliam then backhands Hadrian again, but this time Hadrian has learned and doesn't maybe he rolls with it a little bit or whatever. He doesn't show any emotion, doesn't show him he's bleeding. And Gilliam's trying to beat it out of him. Like, what are you doing here? Trying to be the Inquisitor and doing a good job, or like trying to do his job actually in this situation of like, this is strange. What are you doing here? Are you a threat? What are you trying to do to the Mataros? Like, I'm here to protect them. What are you doing? Why are you in the palace? What do you and that witch have planned? And how do you have the Count implicated? So in his mind, here's the affirmative case that Gilliam is seeing, right? If we're to take a look through his eyes, he sees Hadrian come out of nowhere after speaking to the Cielcin and befriending Valka the demoniac. He's also blaspheming at the Count's table while he is in the ear and teaching the Count's kids every day. So take the fact that we don't know Hadrian, that we know Hadrian as well as we have, and we know his ethics, at least on the page, out of it. From the outside perspective, this is incredibly suspicious.
Especially because the Count isn't doing anything about it. He's allowing it to happen. So it suggests...
Protecting him, actually.
It suggests that Hadrian either has something on the Count, or he's manipulated him somehow, or there's something to gain that is not being visibly shown, right? Gilliam is correct in that something is up, and Hadrian has leverage somehow. It's just he just doesn't understand what the leverage is at this point. And importantly, Valka is now being circled into it, right? So because of their relationship and their presence in the same place at the same time, it's no longer just Hadrian. Hadrian's behavior now affects Valka because of this situation with Gilliam.
And we break the ice on an actual call out. This is the first time our narrator ever gets called out, our main character ever gets called a heretic formally to his face, and particularly by one of the Chantry. There was implications that he was flirting with heresy on Delos in his conversation, and his father stopped him in advance of. There was implications at the dinner earlier in the last chapter that what he was saying was potentially heretical. Now a member of the Holy Terran Chantry is looking at him and calling him a heretic to his face, formally. And he hits Hadrian again. Again, Hadrian has no response, no emotion. And as Gilliam rears back for another slap, Hadrian actually dodges this and begins backing away towards his rooms as he calls the accusations ridiculous. He says, "I'm not your enemy, priest. I didn't ask to be here at all." But regardless, Gilliam has to have the last word. And he says, "If you dare speak to my mother or insult her like that again, I will throw you back in Colossus, slave. Like, do not think that you're in power and control in this situation. Don't ever talk to my mother that way again." And to Hadrian's credit, in this moment, he lets Gilliam have the last word and he walks away, which is probably the best thing that he could have done in this situation.
I get the feeling at this point that Gilliam should not be pushed anymore. And like, it's become extremely tense, right? So we've had several interactions with Gilliam at this point, and it feels like we're about to boil over. So we got to be very mindful moving forward about his behavior, and he can't get away with this forever, right? Like, something is not going to add up. Something serious is going to happen. So he's got to be very mindful about Gilliam.
And we end that chapter and begin our last chapter of today's episode, chapter 55, Quiet. So at a later date, Hadrian heads to Valka's apartments. With the help of Dorian, he has smuggled a really nice bottle of wine out, and he's being really, really awkward. And we don't get an indication of why directly on the page, but we'll get some hints potentially of what that could be. Yeah, he's nervous for sure. And he's at Valka's door, and he knocks at the door, like, whatever. And who opens it or who greets him but a handsome, naked, gray-eyed man. And of course, if we know anything about Hadrian and his sexual ethic as well as his awkwardness, he immediately apologizes and is like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, dude. I must have the wrong room." Although he knows he does not. He's been here basically every day for the past month or whatever. And he looks, he's looking at the other side of the room. His eyes are averted. He says, "Do you know if Dr. Undera has moved rooms?" But then he hears her voice from behind the naked man in the room. And on page 376, he says, "My heart, I cannot tell you what happened to it. It did not sink, but rather left my body entirely and plunged toward the planet's core. I glanced briefly at the muscled young man in the doorway, plebeian by the slight asymmetries in his otherwise perfect face, but beyond that I could not say if he was a courtier or a servant. It mattered not. He was her lover, and she had forgotten about our meeting. She swung into view, languorous, and light-footed as a cat, those golden eyes bright in the scant light of her chamber. She had pulled a long shirt hastily over her head, and her red-black hair tumbled in wild disarray. Flush glowed on her pale cheeks, but there was no embarrassment in her. Before I could stop the silent screaming in my soul and articulate a response, she gasped, "We had a meeting." She pressed a hand to her cheek, remembering, and pressed the other against the back of the man at the doorway. Hadrian.
Brutal.
Oh, dude. The relatableness of this narrator to the male experience is astonishing. I mean, Hadrian is a beautiful a beautiful man, nigh on angel, right? And he is disciplined, and he is, a good fighter and well-read and all this different stuff. And so for all intents and purposes is a catch, right? And the fact that he still feels this deeply about a woman that he cares about and was just getting excited about hanging out with. He's got this nice bottle of wine with him. He's looking for something's different about this night compared to other nights that he's planning on having with her. The fact that he feels this weight, just his heart plunged to the center of the earth, is so relatable.
Yeah.
In a way that is really endearing, extremely endearing.
It's very real. And, what jumps off the page here, interestingly, is that she doesn't seem embarrassed
at all,
which is interesting, right? As time goes on, we'll need to continue that, later in the scene. But it's of massive note that she isn't there's no this isn't what it looks like. That doesn't come out of her mouth. We know that something strange is going on here as this scene starts. So we have Hadrian being really internally upset, and her not appearing to even really flinch at the situation at all on the outside.
She shoos the guy out the door like a cat, go, get out of here. Nobody wants you here anymore. Go, go, go. And Hadrian, as she's doing this, of course, ma'am, I'll leave. And she's like, no, not you. You stay. He's going to go. It's clear this guy is a pleasure servant from the harem. And he responds to her as he leaves, "Call me if you need me again, doctor." And Valka, the only moment we get of maybe embarrassment or sheepishness is as she smiles wryly back to him as the pleasure servant is leaving.
She spanks him as he leaves.
Yeah, she does spank.
Crazy.
Yeah, she does, right? Doesn't she?
Yes, she smacks him on the backside. It says that on the page in front of Hadrian.
I don't see that in my version.
Let's see.
Actually.
"Dial in if you need me again, doctor." The line below that. Valka flashed a British smile and slapped the man's backside.
Okay, that changes. It changes.
Interesting.
She doesn't slap his butt in this one. She doesn't slap him on the ass. It's just, "Call me if you need me again, doctor." Valka flashed a brittle smile. He hurried down the hall naked.
Okay, so my version, we have the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, just a little butt tap. Good job. Good game. See you later. Which is very different, right? It's very, very different in terms of the feelings of it, if you really get down to it.
Yes.
What does it say about her smile? Because I think that also says something too.
Valka
Brittle smile.
Flashed a brittle smile and slapped the man's backside. Yep.
Okay, so that's
Same
a bit
smile.
contrasting because brittle smile to me reads as okay, sheepish, and then moves on. But it's different if you do a sheepish smile and then you smack him on the butt as he leaves the door.
Yeah,
right?
you're being
that's playful
cutesy or flirty. Yeah, exactly.
Hadrian then offers again, look, if now's not a good time, I can leave. And she's like, no, I'm sorry, I lost track of time. Would you like something to drink? And he's like, well, I brought this nice bottle of wine to drink with you. And she's like, okay, you pour, I'll find my things. Hadrian, as she's getting ready in the back, says the Capitol agrees with you and is trying to, in a not so delicate way, address the situation to him and inquire as to the nature of the relationship with this man.
He's being passive aggressive.
Extremely.
Yeah. Passive aggression only works if there is something for the other person to pick up on, right? And she moves quickly past it, just not even noticing it. So once again, the thing that this section suggests to me is that the offense she thinks she made is that she wasted his time and she wasn't punctual, not that she was just intimate with another person. It implies heavily, even though it's not stated on the page, that there's a different sexual ethic going on here because...
And that's exactly what we need to dive deep into now. This is exactly the whole point of this section. We've gotten a foreshadowing moment of this previously, potentially, on them having a different sexual ethic, in that we know that Tavros eschews traditional relationships. The clans, I think earlier in the book, it mentions specifically that like traditional marriages don't exist in Tavros. Monogamy doesn't exist in the same way.
And it's very highlighted here by the fact that she is not embarrassed. She thinks the offense is the time, and the fact that the offense would be the time would suggest that there is not just a little bit of a sexual ethic difference, there is a massive ethical difference, right? That would be like you come over to my place and I'm like in the middle of making dinner and we were supposed to go somewhere. Like, oh, my bad. I didn't realize what time it was. So like it's that casual of the perception of what just happened rather than like a blow up terrible thing. It gives me the sense that Hadrian, number one, is hurt, but also extremely disoriented, like not understanding why his comment is not being picked up on. In a situation in like our culture, this would be crazy. Like it would just be completely out of control. And she would pick up on the passive aggression of him. In fairness to Valka, being direct is better, and Hadrian should be more direct because he's not. There isn't a full discussion about it. It's moved past in a way that it shouldn't have been. It should have been brought up more, and it ended up doesn't because he's not direct with her.
There's a clear let's talk about the differences in their sexual ethic, because she actually displays a sexual, at least in her actions on the page here, are more similar to the Palatine sexual ethic of the time and of the culture than Hadrian is.
Yes.
She sees sex as something devoid of relationship, and that is, she sees no issue or no ethical quandary with calling upon a pleasure servant to relieve this need from her standpoint, right? And just sees him as an object. She like shoos him out the door as quickly as possible, as if he were unimportant and not a person.
I think it's especially interesting from Valka as a character because Valka is so self-righteous about her ethics that it displays something quite interesting in that, if people in the empire have blind spots for the moral lack of clarity of their empire, she's walking around here criticizing, and then she has what from a different lens is a profound lack of moral clarity regarding sex and sex work, essentially, in this universe. It's a weird thing for her to be very critical of this entire dynamic and then use a sex slave within the context of that dynamic. It appears to be a sort of blind spot viewed from a different lens.
Yeah, there could be a potential of sexual liberation in the Tavrosi demarchy that exists that is, let's say, more above board than, the use of sexual slaves, right?
Yep.
But regardless, the ethical outcome is the same. Sex has been removed in the ethical framework in Tavros and in the Empire from the nature of relationships and the nature of marriage and the nature of child rearing and creation. Right. So sex has become only about pleasure and only about the self and the individual in those moments, or the two individuals, or however many in the moment. Right. It's the complications around sex, the implications around sex have been totally removed, and just the hedonistic side exists in both societies.
Yeah. And I think it will be interesting to explore further in the future chapters what Hadrian's upsetness is about, because if we're recalling, Hadrian is hurt by this in part because it's Valka specifically, and this suggests maybe that like she has a lover that isn't going to be him or something like that. But it may also have implications because it isn't just that he's hurt about Valka in that sense. He doesn't like this as a foundational principle. Like he doesn't go to the pleasure area with his brother because he has an ethical problem with the way that sex plays out in his culture. He isn't pushy with Kyra earlier in the book because he feels very uncomfortable with power dynamics in sexual situations. So it's possible that he isn't just hurt about her in that sense, is that he may actually have like an ethical disagreement with her in the future about this being appropriate or not. And this is like a first true like moment where he's crossing paths with something that potentially could be irreconcilable with hers. Thus far, the acceptance of Valka as a person has been, she's kind of messy and she's very assertive and kind of rough around the edges and stuff like that, but she has all these other things. But he stumbled upon his first true value disagreement with someone that he's falling in love with, which I really appreciate as a character thing for Rakio to put into the story is that if we're going to have this kind of dynamic, this person is real in that they're imperfect because she's messy, but also falling in love with someone means grappling with how do they disagree with you on genuinely important things like sex or values. So it will be interesting to see how Hadrian handles this moving forward. Very, very good on Rakio for putting us in this position.
That's a perfect way of putting it. I do want to tie this with a bow with the fact also that outside of the ethical quandary as well, this is an indication to him that like this is the ultimate friend zoning technique, right? Like there's no more like friend zoney way to do this than like you sent your friend with benefits out of the door as you're about to have a meeting with somebody else, right? So there's although they have a value disagreement, there's also a deep, deep sense of this was a relationship that I was pursuing and hoping maybe eventually one day to turn sexual that has taken a turn for the worse because I'm not seen, at least in this moment, especially not in this moment, as on the same page with her as that. He was going down the path of, I want to pursue this as a relationship. She was clearly not. She doesn't see him as a viable sexual partner at this point too. And that's also where some of that deep despair sets in for Hadrian, because the closest thing he's had to a relationship with a woman now is her. And at least for the time being, it doesn't look like that's going to continue in the same vein.
At least from his perspective, right? You know, if we would have to be preemptively getting in Valka's head to know how she feels about this stuff. If you completely decouple sex from romance, you could have this really strange inversion where sex is just like eating a burger and you're not even considering that this would mean it's off limits for her to develop a relationship with Hadrian because they're so decoupled you wouldn't even grasp that it would be communicating that to another person. So it'll be really interesting to see what both of them think about it moving forward. Just
as a note, the name of the servants is different between the versions of the book, probably because it sounds too similar to Marlowe.
Interesting.
It's Marugan in the new version of the book.
Marugan. I like that better, actually.
She brushes the servant off and apologizes again, but as she apologizes, she gives him some sort of physical interaction, touches his arm, which I'm sure helps him. And then he sort of like sheepishly says, we all forget things, I guess. And she's like, I don't. This is another indication that she's got some sort of memory thing going on. She says, I don't actually forget everything. As Hadrian gets this physical touch moment with her, he thinks of Kat near death in the storm drain, and that like sort of kills his vibe for a minute. And the moment remains awkward for quite some time. And then he eventually pipes up and says, there's something that's been bothering me. And she says, just the one? Because she's so cutting, dude. She can slice and dice with if Hadrian is good at quick-wittedness, Valka is just as good, if not better.
Yeah.
Because she's poking his new fresh wound that has just formed. Maybe because she thinks it's silly or whatever, but it's odd that she brings up the fact that, oh, that's the only thing that's bothering you, Hadrian?
Well, it also just might imply that she thinks he is dramatic about everything. So he's got problems.
100%. It is that too, but she's also poking a fresh wound, right? She's salting a fresh wound a little bit.
Yeah, that's fair.
Hadrian then brings up, like, how could the Umand, like, that built that alienage be the same people that ended up building Caliga? It just doesn't square with me. I don't understand. I don't think that they're capable of that sort of masonry. And then she, like, she pauses for a moment and realizes, oh, I haven't shown you Caliga yet. I haven't shown you any of my hollows or whatever. She, like, sets up this whole holograph thing in the room and walks him through with perfect accuracy every fact about everything that she studied about this ruin. And Hadrian is just marveling, one, at the fact that this is so fascinating to him, but also her memory again shines out to him of like, this is impressive, what's going on here. And so this is too much at this point to know that she has some form of ability to record memory or recall memory that is different than anybody else that we've met with in the story so far. And if we're reading very, very closely, we could probably assume that it is technologically related in some form or fashion.
It's been hinted a lot in this particular section that we're reading. Like it just keeps being hammered home here that something is up with this.
As they examine Caliga, it looks as if that Caliga was not carved as part of the rock face, but like imagine a computer game in which the object of this Caliga was clipping through the rock face that is where it is, the coral place where it is there. right? These stones seem to be clipping through the rock in comparison to being from there. And Hadrian finds this dichotomy and this difference beautiful. They talk about the dating potentially of this stone structure, but nobody has been able to get an accurate date on it. These stones appear to be obsidian, and no artifacts or machinery or anything has been found near this site at all. Like, people question how the pyramids were made or whatever, right? They suppose that there at least are graves and there's quarries where they got these stones that they could look at and be like, okay, they probably came from here. Like, there's signs and symbols that people may disagree on. There is evidence that people built this at a particular time in history, and the stones themselves have dating. The fact that there is no evidence of how these got here or how these were manufactured is really, really extremely odd. And the fact that there are no graves makes it even more odd, because normally a structure like this, especially depending on how old it is, would take hundreds and hundreds of years to build, and lifetimes and generations. Hadrian asks how old Valka thinks Kalaga is, and then she prods him to guess, and he's like, 5,000 to 6,000 years old. She's like, no, more. It's like 10, 20. She's like, Hadrian, this is 700,000 years old. To which Hadrian is like, how is that possible? How is that possible? And then Hadrian immediately jumps to the conclusion that, like, if this were the Umand and they were that old and they built it, they would be way more advanced than humans are. There's no way possibly that this could be them. The current Umand clearly do not have the technology to either build that or to have lived that long, that 700,000 years. And to put it in perspective, he's like, humanity at this point has lived maybe 250,000 years, like 250,000 years. And we're spacefaring. So the idea of somebody being 700,000 years old and not spacefaring seems impossible or improbable. They return to Philemon and the unnatural grammars theory of like, well, I don't think it's the Umand because they don't have language and language is distinct or whatever. But then Hadrian pokes holes in her arguments. It's like, well, Kavarad, those giants, like, they're younger than humans, but the like Set al Sud is like there and exists there. But Kavarad, the giants, they speak, but they can't get off planet. And they've been slightly younger, but they should be more advanced if that's the case. To which Valka responds, they don't speak, they sing. And then she takes an aside to be like, oh, this wine is actually really kind of good. And he's like, oh, it's from year 969. And it's this, brand or whatever. And she's like, this wine is worth why did you bring this bottle? This is worth a fortune. And we get an indication that like Hadrian was going to ask her something, like he was going to DTR is what I would say in this situation. He was going to ask her to be his girlfriend or wine and dine her or do something special.
Like that. Yeah.
Because he said, I hoped to have another conversation that night in his narrative. We don't get clued in on what that conversation was. But to me, especially with his like disappointment, that reads like he wanted to define the relationship or begin a relationship.
Or express how he felt or something like that.
Yeah. Which makes the earlier portion of his heart sinking through the core of the planet heart worse. Yeah. It'd be like if I brought you a nice bottle of wine to go to dinner with you, and then you're having sex with your ex, and then they leave the house like as you show up, and then you're like, yeah, let's hang out. It's just
yeah, it's crazy.
Hadrian asks if she has seen the marching towers on Set al Sud, and then she brings up her pictures of these towers and says, they're not really towers, but they're obelisks. Like that, you can't go inside them. And then Hadrian like eyes these towers and is like, these are like really, really dark, like unnaturally dark. And then it like sort of hits him in this moment. There's no way the Umand could have built Kalaga. And he's like looking to Valka for confirmation. She like pauses for a moment, looks away, and is like, I don't think so. Hadrian says they're way too young to have built it. And then he puts two and two together. The Kavarad's towers on Set al Sud, Kalaga, the Temple of Athtenvar on Giudecca, they're all made out of the same black obsidian material. And they are all so similar. And there's a section on page 383 I wanted to read. The towers, Kalaga, I bet even the Temple of Athtenvar on Giudecca, it's supposed to be all black stone too. I stalled out and then pointed at her. You've been to Athtenvar. You don't study the Umand or the Kavarad. You study ... I trailed off, starting through the image of one of the marching towers of Set al Sud, standing defiant against a binary sunrise. Momentarily unaware of the heresy I spoke, I breathed, it's all one culture, isn't it? one species. I sat in a kind of fugue, in a sort of religious transport. It is said that our forebears looked up from Earth's face and into the dark and asked if we were alone in the universe. We were not. But we were not the first. Whoa.
Massive bomb. Giant. Yes. This feels like probably the biggest reveal of the novel thus far.
Yeah.
Like there's something really big going on with the ruins here that is going to make, there is a reason Valka is a character, right? And whatever this is going on, this is the culmination of that. And it will be, first of all, which is very cool to watch Hadrian gradually piece this together over the course of this scene and previously. This feels like almost the thing that Valka was going to kind of hint at previously when they had their conversation cut off that we were left off on
at the
alienage.
Yeah.
So she's almost sort of like waited for him to put it together a little bit here, but massive reveal has gigantic implications for what does this mean for this universe in a human-centric world where we view ourselves as the conquerors and owners of the universe, and yet we weren't the first ones.
That's the immediate thing that Hadrian goes to, is the cornerstone of the Chantry's entire faith is that we were that, and there's evidence potentially that we were not. And so all of it's falling apart in front of his eyes. And at the same time, this is the first time that he's like, oh, I mean, all the things I've said about the Cielcin potential heresy, this is real heresy. Like, this is the vision. He didn't have this, like, when he learned Cielcin, he's like, they're not going to string me up or whatever. I mean, I'll be useful. Like, people have to learn Cielcin. Otherwise, they wouldn't let a tutor me in Cielcin or whatever. If I go talking about this, I'm going to be, even just me mentioning that, even our conversation right now in this moment, we could be questioned. We could be strung up. We could be, heretic could be branded on our face. And we could be thrown out on the streets, if not murdered. And he immediately gets all, like, he wants to know more, but at the same time, he's like, should we continue talking about this? And then he asks her, what would you call them? And she also says, yes, yeah, I'm on the same page as you. Like, she confirms his suspicion, and that's exactly why she is here and studying Caliga. He asks her, it was all mad. I heard a voice, my voice, speaking anyway. What do you call them? I gestured weakly, nearly sloshing wine from my cup. The builders. Valka glanced upward as if checking something written under the arch of her skull. Que cucia menosur. The grave? The quiet, she corrected. I really shouldn't be telling you this. Her tone shifted, turning almost wooden as if she wanted the words out of the way. The diplomatic suites aren't officially monitored, but I don't trust one of your bureaucrats. She starts clamming up. But we get her name for this species, this forerunner theory that she has going on. She calls them the quiet. And then she immediately stops talking about it because this info is dangerous. He asks why that name. It seems like a bit dramatic for her, and he would know. And she says, it makes sense because even on all of these sites, not just Caliga, but on Sat al Sud, on Afton Var, there are no tools, there are no graves, there are no ships. There is zero evidence other than the fact that they've been there an extraordinarily and an exceedingly long time. The buildings themselves are the only evidence that exists of the people who built them.
Yeah. I actually have a question for you. We have heard, the title of the book is Empire of Silence. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been previous references to silence and quiet and all of these things. I was wondering if you think it would be worth reading the previous section from the earlier in the book where there's themes around, there's something going on with this name and this theme. I was wondering if you thought it was worth reading now. I have a perfect.
Chapter 6, you mean?
Page 47. Yes. So readers will recall this is the section as Hadrian is staring at the cruel scene down in Colosso next to his brother Crispin, thinking about leaving Colosso. There was no beauty in that arena, but there was truth. There, while men shouted and died on the killing floor, executed for the diversion of 70,000 spectators, I saw it, or heard it rather. Heard it behind the screams and cheers and laughter of the adoring public as Crispin stepped onto the field amidst smoke, as the duellators and servitors dragged the bodies of the dead slaves towards the lift. A silence, a profound echoing quiet. Not a quiet in the ears, but in the mind. The crowd for it was a singular being, was shouting to drown out the loud silence in their souls. I heard it, but I did not understand what it was, what it meant. Buttoning my jacket, I turned, crossed to the door, and left the box. I needed air. All at once I found I could stand to watch the tableau no longer. It was not my world, not a thing I wished to inherit along with the rest. The peasants cheered as I left the box, cheered for Crispin. He was welcome to it. So there's something narratively going on here about the title of the book. We now have this emerging thing about the quiet, this moral quiet in people's soul. There's something like thematic here that Rakia was going for. And it just feels important to connect with this new thing that we're discovering here. We're not really quite sure what this connection is yet, but the author is making some connection somewhere.
Between, specifically in the term quiet and the morality related to the empire of the day, right?
Yeah, there's like this strange connection of like,
silence,
there's like this,
and quiet,
there's this moral
yelling.
Quiet in people's soul. There's this quiet, ambiguous entity, but then there's the empire of silence that they live in, which even in this discussion, when they're talking about the quiet, they're worried about being like found. They have to be quiet. There's this silence that has to exist in order to keep this secret hidden with that, so that they're not strung up as heretics. So there's like this strange thing that's going on here about this need to be silent and the moral ambiguity of the whole thing. There's something narratively that's going on there that I frankly just kind of missed the first time I read this, that I think is just worth carrying forward in the story. It's happened early. It's happening again here. And we should carry it and put a pin in it for the future.
Hadrian then asks if there's a possibility that, one, he assumes immediately that the Chantry know that this is a potential theory, right? And if they could have removed any evidence that was there at all of these sites, and that's why that there's nothing there. And Valka smiles and said that they could have tried to pull away some of the stuff, but there's no way that they could have removed. There's so little evidence of anybody actually physically building this. There's no possible way that a human could do this, because they are not gods. She mentioned they are still men. They are not gods. She says your Chantry could not have possibly hidden all the evidence. To which he responds, "It's not my Chantry." And then she chuckles and she's like, "Maybe you're right." But Hadrian still can't believe that there's no bodies. And Valka's like, there is literally nothing. There are the stones that these people can build. The only evidence that we have are the symbols that the Umand replicate with their story knots at Kalagat. That's why I'm here. But nobody can read these either. And then Hadrian realizes this is a Rosetta problem, which is a reference to the Rosetta Stone in our time, which was a stone with the translation of Egyptian hieroglyphics, Demotic script, and ancient Greek, which allowed essentially all of us to be able to backtrack and decode how hieroglyphics actually worked. And it wasn't just symbols. He begins explaining this to Valka as like when he makes that Rosetta problem quote. It's like it actually allowed us to backtrack and figure out that the symbols actually corresponded to particular voices and sounds, not just the actual symbols on the thing. And she's smiling at him as probably the same way that he was smiling at her when she was going through all of the things. She is recognizing an intellectual curiosity in him that is shared.
Yeah, and again, it's weird because she's teasing him. She's kind of flirting. She's looking at him like longingly right after what just happened. Right. So it's like this weird dichotomy paradox thing that's happening here where like Hadrian is feeling on the back here now. It doesn't appear that like she's somehow acting differently towards him in this moment other than him seeing this. It's very weird for him.
He then asks, well, then why are you here on Imesh? Like there's got to be, if these exist around the galaxy and around the universe, like there have to be sites that aren't controlled by the Chantry that you could see. And she's like, yes, there are, but they're controlled by the extras. And we get some world building from her here. And the extras mean the extrasolarians, right? These demoniacs that we've heard about that Karn Sagara had fought with in his legends, and as well as who Gibson was accused to potentially selling Hadrian out to, were these, demoniac, technologically advanced people known as the extrasolarians outside of the Solan Empire. And she says that those are the only people worse in the galaxy than the Empire is the extras. So even though she is in Chantry controlled area, knowing that the Chantry is rough, but she fears and she thinks that the extras are worse to deal with potentially than the Chantry, which says a lot.
And it's worth commenting here. It just makes this world feel so lived in that like all of these pieces are starting to come together a little bit. Like, well, why don't you go elsewhere? Well, there's this other faction we haven't really talked about much. They're out there. I can't go there. Like, why has this been kind of a secret? Why can't we talk about it? Because this other faction doesn't want this information to get it. Like, all of the pieces are really starting to come into like this really complex, alive world now. We're not just learning about it, we're playing with all the pieces at this point. It's one of the reasons that I think this book is so good, is that it establishes so much and begins to play with all of it. And it's really underrated in that way. It starts to really do a lot of the work, and it's just, it's really on the page here with including the extras once again, influencing Valka's path.
And to your point, like Hadrian asks, he's surprised that the secret hasn't gotten out. And because, like exactly what you said, the Chantry controls the flow of information. We can assume that data sphere is like internet, right? Like a galactic internet. The data sphere is this interconnected, intergalactic internet that exists. We can assume that at this point, we know that the Chantry controls what goes on there and what gets transmitted or whatever. This isn't free internet age. There is a heavy hand on what goes out there. And Valka's like, that's the reason none of this has gotten out, is because they control the flow of information. She mentions, you Solons have made crime and sin the same thing. You couldn't see truth if it danced naked in front of you. To which Hadrian responds, I could. And an admission from Valka in this moment is, you know what? Maybe you're the exception to the rule. Hadrian then posits, well, why haven't they killed you? If this like information gets out of this room, like we're both going to be dead or worse. And she like moves towards him in this moment, physically towards him, and says, they won't find out. And I'll read this last part. Valka repeated her peculiar gestures, staring up at the ceiling. She stretched at the back of her neck, exhaling sharply. Presently, she crossed the space between us and placed a hand on the side of my neck. I flinched, but all too quickly relaxed into her grip. They aren't going to find out, Hadrian. Peace. She smiled, but in that way that older people reserve for children who do not know any better. I've been here for years. I told Elomas right here in this room. Her smile might have cut glass. He's just fine, isn't he? So she's known about this a long time and has told Elomas, and now we know why Elomas is funding the expedition.
There's so much weirdness going on with Valka in this chapter. We've got the weirdness with the memory. We've got the like staring at the ceiling thing.
Mm-hmm.
We've got this like weird confidence that she has that Hadrian does not have about the surveillance here. Right, like he's like probably the most freaked out about the Chantry in this section that he's ever been in the whole book, and she's just chill. So she's got like, there's like a lot of question marks around what is her ethics, why is she so confident about memory-related things, why does she feel safe to discuss this kind of stuff? There's a lot of open questions here, and we're left on this moment with Sir LMS knowing, which sort of verifies that she's actually correct. She can discuss this fact safely. The question is why and how.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful note to leave us on. What is the quiet, and how can we move forward without being?
I don't know about you. It sounded like the C. Elson was your like cliff moment of like, I'm gonna finish this book, and you just furiously read it.
Yes.
It wasn't that for me as much as this was, because I am a sucker for like a Forerunner race thing, like the Halo Forerunner stuff, like the Halos. I'm all about it. Give me Halos in the Flood. Like, if you give me a Forerunner thing in science fiction, I'm gonna be into it, dude.
I tend to agree. I'm more excited about it on this read, funnily enough. My first read, I was so jazzed for the C. Elson that it sort of consumed everything, and I think I underappreciated the narrative surrounding the quiet and of
the conspiracy.
And frankly, I think part of the reason that this book gets underappreciated is because people tend to value the C. Elson so much over these story elements that are really present in the story. And on a second read, I'm really appreciating them a lot more. The relationship between Hadrian and Valka and the character building it takes to see Hadrian gradually start putting this together independently of Valka. She's like sort of presenting pieces to him, but he's connecting the dots independently. And so it is really entertaining and fun to see this narrative unfold. I'm appreciating it a lot, actually. It's quite fun. And
unfortunately for us, we won't find out very much more about that until later. But we will put a pin in it for now and continue always forward.
And always down.
And we will see you folks next time.
See you folks.
Devil's Rest Book Club is Cameron Elston and Drew Welty. Today's episode discussed chapters 53, 54, and 55 of Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio, copyright 2018. Empire of Silence was originally published by Daw Books on July 3rd, 2018. Quality editing and original music by Cameron Elston. Find us on YouTube. Contact us at devilsrestbookclub@gmail.com. Devil's Rest Book Club is a production of Disquiet Pods. This episode, copyright 2026, Cameron Elston and Drew Welty. Thanks for joining us, and remember, rage is blindness.